Welcome back to Sunrise Daily. We're turning our attention now to National Assembly. We've got Professor Shola Omotola here in Abuja, in our studios in Abuja. Prof, good to see you. Well, he's the researcher for YIAGA Africa Center for Legislative Engagement. Well, you've been working on something, a document, taking a look at the 8th Assembly, and then there will be some perspectives regarding the 9th. So tell us, why is this going on?
Okay, thank you so much for having me on this program. I think it is important I make this point clear from the beginning that I was not the only one that worked on the project. It was actually a team of 4 consultants under the leadership of Professor Atahiru Jega. So I just happened to be one of those other consultants that worked with him on the project. And basically, the project was actually about a scorecard of the 8th National Assembly, where we tried to undertake a critical assessment of the performance of the 8th Assembly in terms of their critical functions, defined in terms of legislation, oversight, and representation. And as we are all aware, the legislature is a very, very fundamental institution of government all over the world, and the role they play is very, very critical to development. So the extent to which the legislature is able to perform those important functions goes a long way to determine the kind of contribution they are able to make to democratic development in the country. And it is on the basis of that rationalization that YIAGA Africa, with funding from DFID, I think, initiated that study to assess the performance of the 8th National Assembly in respect of those core functions of the legislature.
So in terms of the focus, their core function, which has to do with lawmaking, yes, you also spoke about the oversight functions. What is the distinguishing feature that you found worthy of note in that 8th Assembly?
Okay, thank you very much. With respect to lawmaking, I think it is important we highlight 3 basic findings from our study. The first has to do with the number of bills processed by the 8th Assembly. When you compare the number of bills they processed with that of the 7th Assembly, we came to the conclusion that the 8th Assembly actually performed credibly well in terms of lawmaking. At least in terms of numbers, the 8th Assembly processed a total of 2,166 bills that's between 2015 and 2019. Out of these, a total of 515 were passed, 172 by the Senate, and 343 by the House of Representatives. But again, there's also the downside to those bills that were passed, because quite a significant number of those bills, 53 to be specific, were actually declined presidential assent. Of course, there were some other bills that, despite the fact that they have been passed by they were passed by the 8th Assembly, they are still waiting for presidential assent as we speak. But at least when you compare to the 7th Assembly, the 7th Assembly processed a total of 1,367 bills, out of which 205 were passed. So when you compare that to that of the 8th Assembly, I think there was a significant improvement in terms of the number of bills that were processed and in terms of the number that were passed. The other important point I think we need to emphasize in terms of the performance of the 8th National Assembly is the fact that there was also a significant increase in the number of private member bills. One of the fundamental criticisms of the legislature in recent times is to say that most of the bills they passed were usually executive bills. But we find a deviation under the 8th Assembly, so much so that out of those bills they passed, 95.8% were actually private member bills. But of course, it's also important to underscore the fact that most of those private member bills were actually sponsored by professional associations and civil society organizations. But those organizations cannot go directly to the National Assembly on their own to promote a bill. So they have to sponsor it through some members of the National Assembly. And I think for that reason, a significant proportion of those bills were sponsored by private members of the National Assembly. Now, a key third component of the finding in terms of legislation has to do with the gestation period of those bills. And when we talk about the gestation period, we are talking about the length of time, the duration it takes for those bills to see the light of the day. The international best practice is that ordinarily a bill should not go beyond 6 months from its initiation through all those processes to passage. But unfortunately, we discovered that under the 8th Assembly, like in most other assemblies before it, the gestation period for passing most of those bills took longer than necessary. And I have some statistics that I can give to support that figure. For example, a total of 271 of those bills that were considered actually took 351 days at least before they were passed. Okay? That gives a total of 52.6% of the total number of bills that were processed that took over 351 days. Only 47 of those bills took 50 days for them to pass them into law. And those bills that took 50 days were usually executive bills or emergency bills. So you can understand why those ones appear to have taken a lesser period of time before maturation. 14 bills again took about 100 days for them to be passed into law. Another 12 took about 150 days. Another 80 took about 200 days. Another 23 took about 300 days. And another 27 took about 350 days for them to be passed into law. So I think the point we are just trying to make here is that in terms of the gestation period, the passage of most of those bills took longer than necessary. And I think that's an important aspect where the National Assembly will have to see how they can improve significantly. We did not just stop here with these findings. We also attempted to gauge public perception, okay, about their own assessment of the performance of the legislature, I mean the 8th Assembly in particular, with respect to legislation. And what we discovered that public perception was largely in tandem with some of those findings I have made earlier on. For example, 46% of the respondents of Nigerians that we interviewed rated the performance of the 8th National Assembly with respect to legislation to be merely average. Okay? Another 32.7% actually rated their performance with respect to legislation to be above average. Only 8.6% rated them to have performed excellently in terms of lawmaking. And the final point I need to make about legislation is about the inclusiveness of some of those bills that were passed by the 8th Assembly. Nigerians were highly impressed with some of those bills, which they characterized to be highly inclusive. And they gave one popular example that cut across the 6 geopolitical zones of the country was the passage of the Not Too Young to Run bill. For most Nigerians, that was one of the most inclusive bills to have been passed by the 8th Assembly. So in that respect, if you want statistics, 14.4% of our respondents felt the bills passed by the 8th Assembly were inclusive to a very large extent. Another 53.9% felt the passage, those bills were inclusive to some extent, whereas only 25.8% felt those bills were inclusive to a very little extent. And I think that speaks volume about the level of appreciation of Nigerians in terms of the quality of some of the bills passed by the 8th Assembly. And finally, some of those bills were also characterized to be landmark bills or significant legislations. And when you talk about the significance of a legislation, you talk about the public issue they address, the level of enthusiasm and debate generated among Nigerians in the course of their consideration. And again, we can talk about the Not Too Young to Run bill as another example in that respect, and even the North-East Development Commission bill as another important legislation in that respect. So those are the core findings with respect to legislation.
Okay, I was hoping we'll go through some of the issues you raised one by one, but I mean, there you have it. You have given it all to us. But then I think it's clear that this scorecard is going to be very vital for the 9th Assembly. And this is where I need you to clear the air. On one hand, Does the Ninth Assembly have this scorecard? Have you been, interfacing with them? And
Yeah,
has there been any sort of commitment from the Ninth Assembly to following through with some of the recommendations you have given?
yeah, thank you for that question. I think it is important for me to clarify that in the course of this study, we had extensive engagement with the National Assembly, the leadership of the National Assembly at both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and even other staffers of the National Assembly. So they were part parcel of that study. I have a copy of the study here, which I can make available to you at the end of this program. I hope YIAGA will grant me the permission to do that anyway. But again, it's important to let you know that just 2 days ago on Wednesday, there was the official presentation of this same result, of this same report, to the leadership of the National Assembly, and it was received by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So in that respect, I can say yes, that the National Assembly already, they have a copy or copies of the report. And part of the reason why we actually embarked on the study was actually to see how we can assist the National Assembly, especially the current leadership of the Ninth Assembly, to see where the Eighth Assembly did well, to see what they can learn from them, and to also highlight those areas where some improvement can be made. And those recommendations have been contained in the report.
Caught my eye concerns the oversight function of the National Assembly. And you said something about, committees having targets, and when these targets are not met, there should be sanctions. I mean, can you clear the air on that?
Please, can you come again?
I said one of the recommendations that caught my eye was this, that had to do with the oversight function of the National Assembly. And you recommended that, when committees are formed, there should be clear targets, and when these targets are not met, there should be sanctions.
Okay, thank you so much. You see, the current trend in the National Assembly is that you find a situation where committees are inaugurated, members of those committees, and for them to be able to measure up with their oversight functions, they need to at least meet for a certain minimum number of times over a given legislative session. But we realized one of the findings is that some of the committees did very well, especially the Committee on Appropriation at both the Senate and the House of Representatives. They were very, very active, meeting for a significant number of periods over the legislative session. But you find many other committees there, as documented in this study, that do not, some met only once, some did not even meet at all. So when the committees don't meet, it becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to be able to carry out their oversight activities. So when we are talking about, what we are saying is that there should be a minimum benchmark at the beginning of every legislative session, that the leadership of the National Assembly will say, okay, for every committee, it is expected they meet for at least a minimum of maybe six times in a year. So if that minimum benchmark has been established, any committee that fails to measure up to that standard, there should be sanction. Such sanctions could be, okay, if your committee is not meeting up to the prescribed number of time, the chairman of that committee may be removed and a new leadership appointed for that committee. So if those sanctions are put in place, it is our belief that members of those committees, particularly leadership, will begin to provide the appropriate leadership for their members to meet as expected.
I think I would like to see how they respond to that particular part of that recommendation. But when you say that the gestation period for some of the bills passed was low, that it could be better, but the Fifth Senate, for instance, the record showed that the highest amount of bills they passed was 129. Now, the Eighth Senate say that they were able to hit the bullseye, passing 282 bills, the highest ever passed now. That's the record they say they hold. So if you're saying that the gestation period, in spite of these figures recorded, was low, what targets are you looking to achieve if they had improved on their gestation period?
You see, our concern here is not about the number of bills they passed. In terms of the numbers, we have given them that credit for good performance, okay? Because the number they recorded was actually unprecedented since 1999. So for that one, we have credited them for that. But the point we are making is that for each bill there's a minimum, a maximum period of time that is supposed to last. But, and I have suggested that from the literature, from comparative literature and international experiences, it's not supposed to be more than a period of 6 months. But you realize that for political differences, political exigencies, and some other extraneous variables, okay, outside the control of the parliament, possibly. Some of those bills, like I told you, the number of those bills that lasted for 351 days. Whether we like it or not, it is unduly too long. So what we are saying is that the National Assembly, the leadership of the National Assembly, especially those committee members, will have to devise a way, okay, of paying more attention to the length of time each bill is going to take before it is passed into law. Now, that is the point we are emphasizing.
All right, shed some more light on what in some of your recommendations, you spoke about pre-legislative scrutiny to improve the quality of the bills that will be passed. How is that expected to play out?
You see, if you have gone through the report as a whole, you realize that some of those bills that were actually declined assent by the president, some of them were actually for minor reasons. Some typographical errors, some spelling errors and things like that. I think that is totally unacceptable. And that is why we are saying to avoid such minor errors leading to the president declining assent, because many people are just blaming the president probably unnecessarily because they didn't have full information as to why the president declared assent to some of those bills. Okay? So it is not proper for the National Assembly to process a bill from the beginning to the end, take to the president for assent, only for them to be declining assent for just typographical or editorial errors. And that is where we are talking about those at various stages. Appropriate measures will be put in place to ensure adequate scrutiny. Okay, I know, for example, the National Institute for Legislative and Democratic Study, NILS, is there, is the research arm of the National Assembly. And it is there to assist the National Assembly, the legislators, in going through some of those bills. And I know when I was there as a consultant for 1 year, we undertake some of those engagements for the National Assembly. Okay, we call it bill analysis. So the point we are making is that for any
just
bill
hang on.
we want to process,
we'll come back and let you
sure
finish in just a moment. Stay with us. So we need to go, but just give us one punchline. I mean, what was the recommendation in terms of improving the quality of representation that National Assembly members have to their people? Because there was a huge talking and complaint point.
Yeah, but before I talk about recommendation, I think you should just allow me to make a few points about the issue of representation. Because in the findings of the study, we discovered that Nigerians were largely satisfied with the quality of bills, that were passed for the promotion of peace, order, and good government in the country. They were also satisfied to some extent with the issue of oversight. And when you have a reasonable measure of satisfaction with those other functions, that can be taken as an indicator of good or effective representation. But in terms of the core component of representation, we discovered that Nigerians were not satisfied. And when we talk about those core components, what are those issues we have in mind? For example, when you talk about visits to their constituents, to their constituencies and meeting with their constituents, you talk in terms of establishing and managing a functional constituency office. We discovered that most of the constituents demonstrated lack of awareness of the existence of such offices in some of those constituencies that we visited, where we conducted a survey across the 6 geopolitical zones of the country. In a few other places where they acknowledge the existence of such offices, some of those challenges were about the functionality of the office.
Okay,
in
Professor.
terms of the number of staff they have
We need
there.
we need to anchor at that point, I'm afraid. We need to thank you for coming on. Professor Shola Omotala is a researcher, YIAGA Africa Center for Legislative Engagement. So we understand that that will be launched much later today. So thank you for joining us, and we wish you all the best. So let's go ahead and take a look at some tweets now that you've sent in concerning some of the issues you raised today. Ngozi Igbe talking about the communication tax bill. Senators should be objective and stop whipping up sentiments that he's concerned for the poor. He should move for reduction in their huge take-home since they can afford everything themselves.
Interesting. Well, there's a different opinion. This is coming from Edmund Oshoke. Says, Ali Ndume has a better argument compared to the men in Lagos. A welcome idea from the senator that can be refined for revenue generation. In my opinion, in his opinion, that is, FG should work to effect tax collection, or towards effective tax collection, rather than increase taxes or rates.
Well, look at that from Mark Onowaye, who says, this hashtag CST bill is a no-go. Let these lawmakers reduce their allowances and allocations since they want more money for government. They claim they are public servants, yet they do not want to make sacrifices.
Well, the next one is coming from Sapphire at Bar Comfort and says, in my opinion, the communication tax bill is illogical. All these charges imposed on us only favor them, not the masses. It's sickening to think the communication bill will go to the second reading. The mismanagement of funds should be a priority. So there you have what people are saying. And, you know, also just to clear the air, earlier on, we put out some figures for you for deposit and, you know, withdrawal charges. So for corporate organizations, it's 3 million, not 500,000 before you go, oh, thank God it's been reduced. Well, it's still 3 million. So there you go. The right charges there.
Yeah, so you can keep your comments coming through. We thank you all for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. And I will be here. I'm Chamberlain Uso.
I'm Kaido.
Oh, sorry. It's Monday, actually, not tomorrow.
Right. I'm Kaido Kikilu. Have a beautiful day.
Views and opinions expressed by guests on this program are those of the maker and do not reflect the views, opinions, and endorsement of Channels Television.